All right, we're about to get started here. Welcome, guys. Thank you for being here live in the room. And for those of you joining on Zoom, I need to make sure that my Zoom people can hear. Um, Henry and Patrick, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, I've got you, Stephen.
Yes or no? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, talk a little bit, say something.
How
Hey,
are you today,
Steve.
Stephen?
How you
What have
doing,
you been
Steve?
up to?
There we go. Say some more stuff.
How you doing?
Okay, very good. All right. So I've got some people in the room and I got a few people on Zoom. So this class is about standard contingencies in the contract and protecting your buyer. So we are going to be looking at this subject from the perspective of a buyer agency. Now, sellers, this is going to be good when you're talking to sellers too, but the focus here is on buyers. And this is a follow-up to the class yesterday that the legal team talked about the contract and what you need to know about the purchase agreement for contingencies. But today we're going to talk about it from the perspective of you representing buyers. There's 8 things I'm hoping to get to today. One is just sort of a definition of contingencies and what do we mean when we talk about contingencies in a transaction? And not so much because you guys don't know, but so that you can explain it really clearly to buyers and sellers what a contingency is. Then we're going to talk about the loan contingency for a little bit. Then we're going to talk about the appraisal contingency for a little bit. And then we're going to talk about the investigation contingency. There are other contingencies we'll talk about. We're going to talk about how to manage them in an escrow transaction. And then I'm going to just mention my kind of philosophy about this. And then if there's time, will be questions and role play. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay, folks on Zoom, because I'm working with folks in the room live, I would appreciate it if you have a question to just shout it out. Don't feel embarrassed to shout it out. Don't put it in chat because it'll be harder for me to keep track of the chat during our Zoom. So just come off mute and ask your question as we go through. All right, so what are contingencies? Contingencies are optional terms in your purchase agreement. How do I move this guy? Let's move him way out of the way. They are optional terms. They are not required in a purchase agreement. They're optional. Yeah, and they are the way you should think about them as protection clauses for the buyer. So in the class on Monday, she talked about escape hatches. They're ways out, basically, of the transaction. But they actually protect your buyer. Okay. If you use a contingency and the buyer wants to cancel the transaction, this is what gives them the power to do it. The contingency gives the power to the buyer to cancel the transaction, and most importantly, get their deposit back. You're meeting with a buyer, they're putting up a deposit, they're worried about that money. If it's $1 million property, that's going to be 3%. That's $30,000. That's a lot of money, right? So they need to know when it's at risk and when it is not at risk. And that's what this class is going to talk a little bit about.
If you don't want to have any contingency, you just don't add the forms, or is it?
You don't fill out the contract. You put in 0 days, basically. We'll talk about that. But you don't, we're going to get into all of this. If the buyer chooses to give up their rights, then that is true, what you just said. All right, so those are there's first one we're going to talk about is the loan contingency. When you use it, you're giving your buyer a right, a protection for a specific number of days. Could be 17. The contract default is 17 days. But it might be less. It might be 5 days, 10 days, 12 days. You're giving the buyer a right to get their financing. Okay. And the number of days is after ratification, after the contract is agreed to. Buyer and seller agree. We start counting after that, right? They have that many days to secure their loan, basically. Remember that a pre-approval letter that you submit with the offer is not an approval. It is called a pre-approval for a reason. The lender is going to check all kinds of things about the buyer after they've issued a pre-approval, after the property is identified. They're going to check employment. They're going to check all the deposits on the bank statement and all of the withdrawals on the bank statement. They're going to check the tax records going back 2 years and a bunch of other things. They're going to verify that the person is got enough money to pay their mortgage, basically, right? Note that the loan contingency is not the same as the appraisal contingency, which we're going to talk about in a minute. It's strictly about the buyer and their ability to secure a loan based on the buyer's portfolio, the buyer's financial situation. Income, there are 3 elements to your buyer situation: income, assets, and credit. I call it the financial footstool. If any one of those legs is broken, the financing goes away. The footstool collapses, right? So we set a number of days, a specific number of days. So on the day that the contingency is due, the last day, the buyer has certain options. And when you're talking to the buyer and preparing them for the deadline day, you want to go over these options with them even before the day comes, so that when they're actually having to make the decision, they can say, well, yeah, Bill explained it to me. I understand now these are my choices. I just need to make a decision. Let me just let in this latest person. Okay. All right. All right. So what are the buyer's options when the loan contingency is due? They have 3, only 3 options. One option they can do is they can remove the contingency. We also call it waiving the contingency or lifting the contingency. When they do this, they sign a piece of paper called a contingency release form, and that they sign it, and the agent signs it, and the seller sign it, and everyone acknowledges that the buyer has removed that obstacle. The buyer has said, I am good. My financing is great. My lender says it's going to go through no problem. I am ready to buy the property and no longer have that right. That's one option. Another option the buyer can say is, I don't want to buy this house anymore. I couldn't get my loan. And the lender gets on the phone with the seller's agent or sends a nice letter. Sorry, we are unable to do financing for this transaction. And it gets canceled. And the buyer gets their deposit back. Very important. Because they had a contingency. If the buyer had waived their contingency with the offer and written non-contingent, they are committing to buy the home whether they have a loan or not, whether the loan goes through or not. Very risky for some buyers. Now, if the buyer is sitting with tons of cash and they could buy it cash, but they chose to get a loan instead, then they can manage that. But if your buyer doesn't have cash to back it up, they better be pretty confident about that loan before they get rid of their loan contingency. Can anyone think of a very common thing that might happen that would imperil the buyer's ability to get the loan that he might not have anticipated going in? Yes, job loss. What were you thinking?
So Victoria example that HOA has some issue and they said.
Yes, but that could be covered under a different contingency. But yeah, the lender wouldn't do the loan because of an HOA matter. That's a lender issue. If they have a loan contingency and they couldn't find another lender to do it, then yes.
But before putting an offer, pre-approval is required by the buyer, right? So,
In our area, it is customary to have a pre-approval with the offer, yes. But the pre-approval doesn't mean that all the rocks are uncovered and all the stones unturned. There still could be stuff happening. It's not a guarantee. A pre-approval is not a guarantee. Things can still happen,
Sorry.
like they could lose their job. Was there
Sorry,
a
Stephen, you
question?
mentioned, yeah, sorry, you just mentioned then the point about just having, that lender turning your loan down. Is it incumbent upon you then as a purchaser, if one lender has refused you a loan, to go and visit a second, possibly third, possibly fourth lender? Or if one lender says no, you can just walk away?
If I'm understanding your question, you're asking if, sorry, one second. I'm trying to make sure. Henry, can you hear me still?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
No, he can't.
Yes, I can.
Okay, Henry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes, I can hear
so it's a great question. But if the buyer has a commitment in the transaction to get their financing secured, the seller doesn't care so much if they switch lenders in the middle, so long as they don't change the terms of the deal. Now, they are going to write an offer. They're going to provide a pre-approval letter with lender X. But at the end of the day, lender X can't perform, but buyer has lender Y right in backup, all set to go. So long as the buyer isn't changing the down payment, so it's still 20% down or 10% down, the terms of the financing aren't changing in terms of the seller. How much is cash versus how much is finance? As long as that's not changing, the seller will be thrilled that the buyer has a backup position.
Right. But if the buyer wanted to walk away.
Well, why would the point be to, I'm sorry, you're saying they want to walk away?
If that first loan is refused, could the seller then force the buyer to say, look
No.
at a second or third lender?
Well, if the seller has a lender who will do the loan on the same terms with the maximum interest rate as specified in the contract, then that is an option. And the buyer would be compelled, if the buyer can get the loan with the interest rate that they said in the offer was their maximum interest rate so they could do the deal, then the seller could absolutely put that in front of the buyer. I don't think the buyer could say no.
Okay.
If you are canceling the contract for the loan contingency, do you have to produce any documentation in support of the claim?
Yes, when you write an offer, sorry guys, I'm having trouble with the sound on my Zoom, and I want to make sure that I'm going to just stop sharing for just a minute so I can fix the sound. Okay. I think this will work. Can you hear me, Henry, still? You can still hear me? Okay. All right. So the question in the room is, what happens if, ask me your question again.
If the contingency is considered for canceling the contract, we have to provide any documentation in support of your loan not getting through or anything to that effect.
If the buyer cannot obtain the loan and wants to cancel using the loan contingency, the listing agent has a right to ask for a letter from the lender. Yeah. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the listing agent has been on the phone with the buyer's lender because everyone's trying to save the deal. So the listing agent doesn't need paperwork on it. He just says he understands, right? And they move on. They may have a backup buyer and backup. The seller may have a backup buyer and not care, right? The seller cannot force the buyer to the seller doesn't have a cancellation right associated with this unless the buyer, well, we're going to get to that in a minute. We're going to get to what happens if the buyer doesn't do anything in a minute. So buyer's choices, they can lift the contingency and continue forward, meaning they're saying they're going to buy the property even if they lose their job, right? Or they can cancel the contract and get their deposit back. Seller can't stop them from doing that. They have a third option. They can go to the seller and say, we need more time. Mr. Seller, we need an extra week to finish the loan. And the seller does not have to agree to that. If the buyer doesn't get more time, then they have to take one of the two steps. But sellers are more likely to give more time because they don't want to go back on the market. They would prefer to get the home sold, so they're more likely to give more time if the buyer asks for it. Yes.
The extended time being my claim more time to get the loan. The loan came through, and they're gonna close next time.
No, that's great. So I don't know if everyone on Zoom heard that, but a person in the room had a buyer who asked the seller for more time under the loan contingency, and then that extra time did the trick. And so now they're going to be able to close next week, which is great. So is everybody clear? There are basically only three options with the loan contingency. You either lift it, cancel the contract, or negotiate for more time. In the failure of the buyer's agent to communicate any one of these three things, the seller can then push the button to force the buyer to act. So the way our contract works, the buyer must be pushed. The seller can't do anything arbitrarily. So if the buyer didn't negotiate for more time, didn't cancel, and didn't waive the contingency, and the day came and went, the seller can sends out something called a notice to perform. And that document says, hey, buyer, do what you need to do. Either cancel or perform. And if you don't, Meister Seller, after a few days, I'm going to cancel on you. Now, let's suppose the seller initiates the cancellation that way. They give the buyer the warning, the notice to perform. The buyer still doesn't perform, and the seller says, forget it, I'm going back on market. Or to my backup buyer, I'm sending you a cancellation under this term of the notice to perform. Does the buyer get their deposit back in that case?
No.
Yes, they do. They do. If the seller cancels after a notice to perform is not executed, the buyer gets the deposit back.
Isn't it unfair?
That's not for this class to decide. The contract favors the buyer. It always has, and it probably always will. In California, it favors the buyer. The seller can only fight for the deposit usually if the buyer doesn't close escrow. Then the buyer can make a claim to keep the deposit, or if they don't open escrow, right? But if the buyer if the seller forces the buyer's hand with a notice to perform document to release a contingency, any of the contingencies we're talking about today, and the buyer still doesn't perform and the seller cancels, they have to give them the deposit back. Yeah. But then the seller can sell the house again. So, all right. Yes.
Steve?
So if you're negotiating for more time, what happens to the previous agreement? Do you have?
It's just an amendment to the agreement. We have a special form for negotiating for more time called the Extension of Time Addendum, ETA, and that's the form you use. Your mentors will help you with it. But basically, you say to the seller, we need 10 more days, or we need till Friday on this contingency. The seller could choose to agree or not to agree because it's a change to the terms. Sellers usually agree because, again, they don't want the deal to blow up, usually. Yeah.
What are the most common reasons when the buyer would need more time?
For a loan contingency, the lender's having trouble with the HOA. The lender's having trouble with buyer proof of employment, maybe. There's lots of reasons. The buyer co-signed on a loan when they weren't supposed to. The buyer lost their job. The buyer had something change, a substantial change in their financial condition that the lender didn't know about before. All right, let's talk about the appraisal contingency. It's a separate right that the buyers have. The appraisal contingency gives your buyer the right for a specific number of days to get an appraisal at or above the price they are in contract for. Now, I have a whole class on my coaching channel about appraisals and how to manage appraisal contingency and what an appraisal is and all of what you do and there's a discrepancy. So we're not going to spend as much time on it today as we do in that class. But if you have this contingency in place and the appraisal comes in, the deadline day for the contingency comes and the buyer has options. Here, and there's way more. In the case of an appraisal coming in low, the buyer can, like before, waive, lift, or remove the contingency. Under what circumstances would the buyer lift or remove the contingency for an appraisal? Why would they just say, we're ready to go on?
If there's somebody else that wants to also buy that property.
No, 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 no. You're under contract. There's no other buyers in play.
Oh,
We're talking about the buyer, not the seller. Okay? Your buyer has an appraisal contingency and they say they want to lift it on the deadline day.
Valuation comes lower than.
No, the valuation, when the valuation comes in at the same price.
Yeah. Or higher.
The buyer's gonna waive the contingency if the valuation is there. That's the simple case, right? Yeah, the property's in contract. Maybe the property was listed for 800,000, but there was a bidding war and it got in at 850 with an appraisal contingency. The appraiser comes out and says, yeah, sure, it's worth 850. Buyer lifts the contingency and moves on. That's case one. Case two, the contingency comes in lower. The buyer can arbitrarily cancel. Okay, and do they get their deposit back? Yes. Now, let's think about this a little bit. Let's suppose they're in contract for 850. The appraisal came in at 800. There's a $50,000 discrepancy. The buyer can cancel even if the seller was willing to work with him. It doesn't matter what the seller thinks. If they have an appraisal contingency and it comes in low, they have a right to walk away. Why? Is it a good faith issue? No. They have a right to walk away as long as they stay in good faith. But the good faith side of this is the buyer doesn't want to pay more for a house than what it's worth.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what's interesting about this is what happens if the seller says, I'll lower the price all the way? Does the buyer still have an obligation to agree to that change in the contract? No, they don't, as long as they're operating in good faith. And that's where it gets really messy. All right, the third thing they can do, we just talked about this.
What is good faith?
Good faith. Does everyone know what good faith is? It is doing what you say you're going to do. You sign a contract to pay your agent 3%, you pay them the 3% if no one else will. Good faith means any contract. It's contract law 101. This is a real estate sales contract. So any contract the people sign, they are making an agreement to do what they said they agreed to do, to work in good faith. That is, they don't have an ulterior motive. They don't have a hidden agenda. I say I'm going to buy your house. I'm going to make all effort to buy your house. I'm not going to be scheming behind. Here's an example of bad faith you will encounter. You get into contract with your buyer and they still want to go look at other houses. That's bad faith. Huh?
That's common.
It's not for you. You're not going to let it be common. You should not go show homes to your buyer after they've written an offer. Then you're operating in bad faith. Then you've got a bigger problem. Why did they sign the contract in the first place? And that's a much deeper conversation about how to protect them and yet make sure you're working with serious buyers. But that's good faith. Good faith is basically doing what you said you're going to do. So we can remove the contingency. We can cancel the contract. We can also negotiate with the seller. Mr. Seller, the appraisal came in 50,000 lower. You should give me the house at the price that it came in at, not at the price we negotiated. Sometimes you get 50-50. You split the difference, right? That's negotiable. You can request that the lender do an appraisal review. You can get a whole new lender and a whole new loan and get a new appraisal, so long as you do it in the time frames agreed to with the seller. The seller may say, hey, I've got a lender that can do this and get it appraised. That's an option on the table too. Maybe your lender can modify the financing to get the necessary discrepancy funds. So let's suppose it's only a $10,000 discrepancy and they're putting down 25%. What if they put down 20%? That means they save 5% of the purchase price, and that's the $10,000. So the buyer might be able to move their financing, move their financing around with their lender to make it work and not need to go to the seller and request anything.
When the valuation is a little lower, why would buyer want to pay more for it?
Buyer, you mean the price they agreed to buy it for, because they really want the house. They bid against 10 other people. They really want the house. That's why. And they can negotiate for more time, by the way. Mr. Seller, we got the appraisal back. We need to look it over carefully. There's some questions my lender has for the appraisal company. We need another week before we can lift the appraisal. That is another common thing. And sellers usually agree to that one.
But
Yes.
when it says like get a new appraisal, so the new appraisal can change the valuation as well?
Yes. I had one a few years ago where the home was under contract for like 800,000 and the appraisal came in at 740. 60,000 below. My lender, my broker got a new lender. They brought out a new appraiser and it appraised at sale price within a week. Within a week. So appraisers are not gods. They're just human beings making an evaluation.
So, but the new appraiser guy does not know about the previous valuation, was he?
No, he wouldn't know. He wouldn't know.
One of my friends, she had a contingency, but it was not appraisal contingency, but her appraisal came at almost 100K below.
But did she have an appraisal contingency?
No, she didn't have appraisal
Yeah.
contingency, she had inspection.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter. She cannot cancel the deal on that term.
Yes.
She might be able to cancel for other reasons, but she can't cancel on appraisal if she doesn't have the contingency in place.
In that case, she can't even negotiate for that.
She can try, you can always try to negotiate everything, but it's harder. So if without the appraisal contingency, the seller will say, you know what? We had 5 offers. We took yours. It was the highest price. And you put your money where your mouth is. You wrote without an appraisal contingency. You were telling us that you had the funds. And I saw your down payment and I saw your proof of funds. I saw your pre-approval letter. I saw your proof of funds and your pre-approval letter. And you are committed to buy my house without an appraisal. So the fact that the appraisal came in low, too bad, so sad for you. You're still going to buy my house, right? So the seller would have an argument there if they tried to negotiate without the contingency in place. That's why these are such powerful terms for a buyer.
Can you
Right.
go back one slide? Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, you can get a copy of all these slides at the end. I have a QR code to get the copy of the slides.
Thank you.
All right.
So one question,
Yes.
anytime you negotiate for any reason, is there an addendum that you do? for-
Yes. Anything negotiated must be in writing. We call it an amendment. If it's an existing contract, we use the extension of time addendum for time issues, and we use an amendment form for changes to the terms, other changes to the terms. Everything must be in writing, nothing verbal. Okay?
Steve,
All right.
Steve,
All right, let's move along. Let's talk about the investigation contingency. This is the
Uh,
most powerful tool in the toolbox.
I'm sorry, Steve,
This
can
is
you hear
the
me?
best one for your buyer. It
Steve?
gives the buyer the right for a specific number of days after the deal is done to research everything they care about, anything and everything they care about. And then on the deadline day for their investigations, which is anything and everything they care about, they have certain options. And this is going to look a little familiar. They can say, Mr. Seller, we still love your house. We read your reports. We looked at our own inspectors' reports. We talked to all the neighbors. We went to the board meeting of the HOA. We looked up the crime stats. We looked at the schools. We studied everything and we still love your house. We're moving forward. They can cancel. Oh, I'm really sorry, Mr. Seller. As per term 14B3, we're canceling. You guys as the agent are under no legal obligation, nor should you tell the seller's agent a reason. Now, sometimes it'll be obvious. You know, you've been working for a week on remediating the problem with the furnace that came up and the roof is also a problem, and you've been talking to the listing agent and he knows this deal's shaky. But let's suppose he doesn't know. If they ask you why are they canceling, you say, as per the buyer's rights in section 14B3, I think it is. Whatever it is, refer to the contract. And in the contract, the buyer has no affirmative obligation to tell the seller why. Okay? They could simply have decided they didn't like the feng shui, or they didn't feel good when they met the neighbor's dog. It could be anything, right? Now, if the seller can prove that they're operating in bad faith because they've been writing offers on other houses for a week, then that could get them in big trouble. And that sort of stuff could get back. You don't know what agents are talking with which agents about offers coming in and who's representing who. That's a very dangerous game for your buyer to play. So there has to be good faith. But if there is good faith and the buyer cancels the transaction, the buyer has to get their deposit back.
Is this the most risky contingency for the seller?
Yes. From the seller's perspective, it is the most risky contingency. And in a regular market, which isn't strongly in favor of the seller, they happen all the time. Buyer has other options though. They get to the end of the period of time, they can negotiate for more time. Mr. Seller, as you know, I shared the home inspection with you. We have a problem with the furnace and with the roof and with the foundation. And my clients really need to have a structural engineer come out to look at the foundation. And we need to have a roofing bid done. And I can't possibly get that done. The first inspector's available next Wednesday. I need another week. That happens all the time. Again, easy to negotiate most of the time with sellers. Once you've done all the due diligence or at the time of the contingency release, the buyer can take other steps. They can go to the seller and say, Mr. Seller, we didn't know from your disclosures about the roof or the foundation or the furnace. We want you to reduce the price or give us a credit for $20,000 for our troubles, and we'll still buy your house then. Now, there's a big difference between a price reduction and a credit. Okay, a price reduction will reduce the buyer's closing costs a little bit and the seller's, including property taxes. But the buyer doesn't really save a lot of cash. But if the seller gives a credit against the original price, that can be used against the buyer's closing costs and reduce their out-of-pocket. They save more cash to put in new furniture and paint the walls. So there's a big difference between those two. When you have a buyer who doesn't have a big down payment, who is putting down 5 or 10% or less, the credit is usually more attractive to them. They want to preserve cash. If you have a buyer who's putting down 30, 40%, usually just do a price reduction, it reduces your property taxes, it reduces your real estate fees and all those other things. But you can negotiate for that. Sellers are very often inclined to work with you. I'd say 1 in 5, they say no way. But most of the time, they're willing to work with you, even if it was a multiple offer situation to begin with. Why? Because if they go back to market, there's no guarantee they're going to get the same price, and there's no guarantee how long it's going to take. So a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the tree, so to speak. And another thing you can negotiate for with this investigation contingency is repairs or maintenance. You can say to the seller, we're ready to move forward as long as the seller replaces the furnace before the close of escrow. That sort of thing. It's another path forward. All right, any questions so far? Any other questions so far?
Is it different than the inspection contingency?
Yeah, there is no inspection. Well, I shouldn't say that. Yes, it is far more powerful because it covers not just the physical inspections, but it covers the neighborhood issues. It covers everything and anything that you care about. So it's a broad category. It's much bigger than just inspections. I don't even like to call it. A lot of people use the terms interchangeably, so don't do that. Call it what it is, an investigation contingency. Do you have a question?
Yeah. Clarify me on this, how this credit works, like.
How the credit works?
Yeah.
So let's suppose you're in contract for $1 million. And the buyer goes to the seller and says, I want a credit of 20,000. So what happens is they write it up and they say 20,000 credit for closing costs. We call it closing costs. And then when the buyer writes their check at the end, they're going to write their check for 20,000 less than they would have otherwise. They just would write their wire at the end of the deal is going to be a little less.
Yeah, the amount you just deducted from whatever.
More or less. The lender will tell them the exact number. Sorry?
Does it work like a discount?
It's a discount on closing costs, not on the price. So they're still buying the property for the same price. They still need to put 20% down, but the closing costs are usually 2 or 3% of the price. So if closing costs are 3% on $1 million house, that's 30,000. So you could do a credit up to 30, and then ultimately they could buy the house without any closing expenses. The cost of the money the buyer puts in their deposit and then the balance of their down payment plus closing costs. So there are three elements to what they ultimately put into the kitty, right? And so if there's a credit for closing costs, the total of the three checks is smaller.
But if the credit is coming from the seller, shouldn't it affect the purchase price?
No, it's not affecting the purchase price. The property taxes are going to be based on the purchase price, the transfer taxes, the real estate commissions,
No,
but this
it's not-
protects some of the buyer's cash. If they do a price reduction, they're still going to be putting in a very close to the same down payment, and their closing costs are going to be very close to the same. The price will go down a little bit, but it won't mean less money out of pocket for finance buyers, right? If it's a cash buyer, it doesn't matter. You wouldn't do a credit. You would just do a price reduction if it's an all cash buyer. But if they're getting a loan of 90, let's do in their FHA, 96.5% loan, 3.5% down, getting a $20,000 credit saves them significant, keeps more money in their pocket, and the amount of their carrying cost doesn't change very much at all. It's far better for them to get the 20,000 than to reduce the price by 20,000 because their monthly payment won't change hardly at all, nor will their closing costs.
Specifically for the repair, so if seller is giving credit for, say, repair of the house,
Yeah.
shouldn't that affect, because the property is kind of worth less than previously agreed upon?
Then they reduce the sale price.
So that should reduce.
No, that's negotiable. Okay, so you can tell the seller, I want you to reduce the price. You can tell the seller, I want some cash back against my expenses, or you can tell the seller, I want you to do repairs. One of those three. You don't usually see both together. Now, if you want to be very aggressive, you can say to the seller, I want you to reduce the price 20,000 and do these repairs. Sometimes that happens, but not that often. Usually you as a buyer's agent is going to pick one. Usually. Sometimes there are exceptions with repairs though. Let's suppose it's something that there's a special expertise. Let's suppose the seller has some special expertise and they're very handy and they've taken good care of their house. Maybe it's a flipper who has his own team of people, and there's something you want fixed before close of escrow, plus you want a credit. Sometimes you mix and match. Okay, let's keep going. There are other contingencies in the transactions. One contingency is for sale of buyer's property. Sometimes you're going to have a person who owns a house who needs the money from that house to get to their down payment on the house they're buying, right? That's a sale of buyer property contingency. It gives the buyer the right for a specific number of days to complete the sale of their own home prior to completing the purchase of the new home, because they need to move the money over and they won't have it till the other deal is done. On the deadline day for this contingency, the buyer can lift the contingency and continue to close. They can cancel the deal. I wasn't able to sell my house. I'm not going to close on time. Get their deposit back, or that negotiate for more time, which is the one that for this one, the negotiation for more time happens more often than not, than the other two.
In this area, is it common to have the sale of home?
I wouldn't say it's common. I've done a few. I did one last year. It's not hugely common. It depends. It depends how long the property's been on. Like there are issues. If a seller's having trouble selling their house, even in a hot market, they'd be more open to this than in a cold market. But you're right. It happens less in our market than it might happen in much cooler markets. There are other contingencies. You can have a special contingency for getting home insurance. It's in the contract. You can have a special contingency for reviewing the seller's documents, reviewing HOA documents. This is a big one. Let's suppose that your seller had a perfect package, but it didn't have the HOA docs in it. Okay. And let's suppose that you wrote the offer with an investigation contingency and your investigations were fine. You didn't turn up anything, but the HOA docs aren't in play. They're late arriving. If you have this review of HOA docs contingency, you can have the same rights. You can lift the contingency at the time it's due. You can cancel. Hey, you didn't deliver me the HOA docs by day 10. We're out of here. Or you can say, we'll stay in contract, but you have to give us an extra week until we can have a good chance to review all this paperwork. Very common. By the way, guys, as buyer's agents, you should never expose your buyers to non-contingent if you don't have HOA docs. If you get a great package from the seller and the disclosure package has a home inspection and pest inspection and a love letter from the seller about how many years they've lived there and what a great neighborhood it is, and everything is dotted and all the I's are dotted and T's crossed and it looks great, but they're missing HOA docs, you need a contingency. And I would have a long conversation with the listing agent so they don't penalize you because of it. And you know another agent out there who's willing to risk his client's money because they're and write with non-contingent if there's no HOA docs, that's an irresponsible agent. That is not an agent who's acting as a fiduciary. Might you lose to such an agent? Yeah, maybe. But it's you can't put your client, especially with HOA docs, you can't put your clients at risk. Okay. All right.
And I have a quick question. For the
So when you're thinking about writing your offer, please work not just with discussing the timelines with your buyer, but with the lender or anyone affiliated with the buyer, like a family member or a trustee or whatever, and figure out the appropriate number of days you should ask for in the offer. The offer standard is 17 days, but in our area, most contingencies when they occur are less. How many days do you need? How many days can you try to negotiate for? It depends on how many other offers there are, depends on what your needs are, what your buyer's needs are. Obviously, if there's 10 offers, right, you might want to shorten these contingencies up or have a hard conversation with your buyers about whether they really need them or not, right? Remember that contingency deadlines are based on calendar days, but they get extended if they fall on a weekend or a holiday. So let's suppose it's 10 days. Day one is the day after acceptance. So let's today in this office, it's Tuesday. So let's suppose you get into contract today, then Wednesday is day one. And let's suppose it's a 5-day contingency. So Wednesday is day one, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday is the 5th day with a 5-day contingency, but you can't remove contingencies or take any action on a weekend. So it turns into 6 days because it'll be Monday that action can happen. Okay.
When you're counting the days, you don't consider the holidays.
You count the holidays, but nothing can finish on a holiday. You count all calendar days, but deadlines for contingencies cannot expire on a non-business day. Okay. Same with closing, by the way. The day that the transfer of title happens, the day they get the keys, cannot be a non-business day. Yes.
Question. So sometimes the observed holidays are different, like not each holidays are observed by all like financial institutions and things like that.
Ask escrow. If you think there's going to be a conflict, ask your escrow officer, is this day a holiday? For legal purposes. What it really comes down to is whether escrow is open, whether the county recording office is open. Yeah. Yesterday was President's Day. All the business offices were closed. It's considered a holiday. Even though I worked yesterday. Any of you guys worked yesterday? Many of us worked yesterday, right? All right. As you're working through a transaction, it's important that you keep your buyer informed about the deadlines coming up. They should not be blindsided. You should not be calling them on day 10 of a 10-day contingency saying, okay, time to make a decision. They should know it's coming, okay? At least a few days ahead. The better your communications are throughout the transaction about potential problems, the more likely you are to win the concessions from the seller. If you've been having a good relationship with the listing agent and you told him about the problems that came out of the home inspection, he's had a chance to prep himself and his seller. And so when you ask for the extra 5 days, he'll be more likely to grant it than if you spring it on him at the last minute. However, there are strategic reasons why you might want to spring it on him at the last minute. Okay, so it all depends on your relationship with them and what it is you're going to be looking at, because you may not know until the last minute that there is a need for a negotiation. So you don't want to unduly alarm the other side either. Okay, but remember that your buyers have all the power in the transaction, legally and politically, after the seller has agreed to sell the house to them. There's no other people competing for the house anymore that have a right. And who can cancel? The buyer in almost all cases. The seller can only cancel after they push the buyer who didn't do what they were supposed to do. So first your buyer has to not perform, not do what they were supposed to do, removing a contingency. Then the seller has to say, okay, do something, or then I'm going to cancel. So your buyer has a lot of power in this transaction. And so the seller is just hoping everything's going to go smoothly, as is their agent, right? And so your job is to remember that. And also, let's suppose you want to get a $20,000 price reduction because there's problems with the house and you want them to repair the furnace. And while we're at it, give me a $10,000 credit. You want the works. You write it up. What is the risk legally and for the contract for the buyer for you to write up an amendment and send it to the other side? What is the risk for your buyer?
Seller can refuse.
Yeah, so what? If the seller refuses an amendment, is the deal dead? No. It just means the seller did not agree to change it. So the original deal holds true. So you, as a buyer's agent, and your buyer could ask for the moon. You could ask for the firstborn child. You could ask for anything. The seller says no, and you can decide then whether you keep moving or not. Let me give you a real life example. Some years ago, I represented a seller who on the MLS disclosed that there was air conditioning. Buyer went in and the buyer had a contingency. And the buyer went in and did their own inspections and there was no air conditioning. Okay, now there's issues about what I should have known as their agent, but let's put aside what I should have known about as their agent. Let's talk about what happened next. What happened next is the buyer said, we want a $10,000 credit because you told us there was air conditioning in the MLS and there is no air conditioning there. And we went back to the seller who said, oh, oops, sorry. And the buyer asked for the credit and the seller said, no way, they buy it or they don't buy it. I'm not going to budge an inch.
But there's a contingency.
No, they could walked away, but they didn't. The buyer ended up buying the property. So there was no harm for the buyer in asking. The seller didn't have a cancellation right, but the seller didn't agree. Now, because of the nature of the market at the time, the buyer still bought the property. That was their side decision, right? But there was no, anyway. So just because a buyer asks for something doesn't mean the seller has to give it. And just because the seller doesn't give something doesn't mean the deal's over. The deal is controlled by the buyer until the buyer fails to perform when they're obligated to by the contract.
And who decide, like, buyer said $10,000 for air conditioning, but that actual value, is it 10,000 or who decide that value?
Well, what we like to do, if it's a physical element, is get a bid and provide support. Mr. Seller, here's a bid from two HVAC companies. One is saying 9,500, the other is saying 10,500. We want 10,000 right in the middle. Something like that. Yeah.
Other than the negotiation part, isn't there any other consequence for having incorrect information in the listing?
It could be, except that the listing MLS is not a legal document as per the contract. It's not the question of how big a disclosure element it is relevant. If the transfer disclosure statement doesn't say the air conditioner is there, that may be higher priority around disclosure. But you're right. There is an issue if they had closed the deal thinking there was air conditioning there and there wasn't. And after they could have come back and said, you told us there was air conditioning, then maybe, but not if it was disputed elsewhere. I mean, it could have been an issue. Yeah. But it was discovered during due diligence and it didn't become an issue. But you're right. But the MLS is not the best place for disclosure. Disclosure belongs in the legal documents associated with the transaction. So just because the MLS says something, we always say, just because it's in the MLS, you shouldn't rely on that. Go check it. Whether not just appliances, but whether, other things that the MLS might say about the age of the property, about the square footage, about other things, how much the monthly HOA assessment is. The good buyer's agent is always going to check on all that stuff.
So you talking about the description mention or the link of the disclosure, which actually gives the disclosure of the property? Which one you should rely on?
The link.
The link we should.
Yeah, but in this case, the link would have the MLS printout as well. A good listing package will have the MLS printout as well as the description of the property, the other documents. So I think Manish is raising a decent issue, but it's off a little bit off course. So we're winding down anyway. I want to cover on a couple other things before we end because it's almost 3 o'clock. I want you all to remember that you have a fiduciary responsibility to look out for the best interests of your buyers. Therefore, you should you should have the conversation about the competitive issues with keeping contingencies, even in a multi-offer situation. We want you to have the conversation with them, even if the only way they're going to win it is by lifting all their contingencies, right? You should never be the one who says, you have to do it, Mr. Buyer. You don't want to be that agent. Oh, if you want this house, you have to write non-contingent. No, you don't want to phrase it that way. You want your buyer to decide based on their understanding of the risks. It's not your money. So you should say, I always want my buyers to keep their contingency in place because it protects them. Without these contingencies, Mr. Buyer, here's all the awful things that could happen. Are you really still prepared to lift these contingencies in order to be competitive? And to help you with that, there is a form. They talked about this. They talked about this in the class yesterday, the non-contingent offer advisory form, which is a perfectly good form to go through with your buyer when they want to write non-contingent so that they sign it. You can even include it with the offer and they know the risk they're taking. And then it's not your risk, because I promise you, if you write non-contingent, if they write non-contingent, and then they find out something afterwards that they would have found out if they'd done their own due diligence, they're going to sue everybody, including you. Oh, my agent said I had to write non-contingent. That's what they're going to say.
This form will protect.
Well, to some degree, yes. Absolutely, this form will. A judge will look at this and say, well, you were told. You even signed. This form is not a standard form, Mr. Buyer. Did you not know what you were reading? I mean, I don't know. I don't know what the argument would be in court, but it would protect you somewhat, yes. And plus email history of conversation. Yeah, even text chains.
Mostly.
It's called the non-contingent offer advisory. It's a very good form. Even if you don't use it, you should at least go over it with your client.
One quick thing, so sometimes you have a phone conversation, say with your client. Whatever you discuss on the phone, do you want to capture it in the email and send it just for your?
Something like this, yes. If it's going to protect if it's going to be something that could come back later. Yes. If you're on an environment where it's just a casual conversation, you can say, I'm going to follow this up with an email to memorialize what we talked about. And what I like to do is go one further step. I send the email and then I say, please respond to this email that you got it and reviewed it. I like them to reply. That helps again with the same argument, right? Yes.
Let's say there's this house which have almost 10 offers.
Uh-huh.
And to win that offer, of course, seller would love non-contingent offer.
Yes.
So, I mean, I have a buyer who is keep on putting the contingent offers and every time it's getting rejected. So what is the solution?
What is the what?
Solution for it. But because if I do non-contingent, we are like not protecting the buyer.
Yeah.
But
it's
if
not
we're-
your risk to take. So the conversation with the buyer is, look, we've written 10 offers. We haven't been winning. And one of the reasons is in this market, we need to write without, if you want to win against 5 or 6 or 7 other offers, it looks like you're competing with people who are willing to give for the buyers to lose those rights. I really want to protect your rights, but I also want you to get a house you like. So we either come to a position where you're comfortable with that risk, Mr. Buyer, or we stop looking right now and wait for the market to cool down. Right? It's not really like there's a lot of other options, right?
Yeah.
You can also say, we can try again and with a shorter time frame on the contingencies. Or we can try to do as much pre-inspection as we can before we even write the offer. Maybe you want to, if you have a specific concern, we can do some due diligence before the offer deadline. to get ahead of it, to reassure you?
Kind of invest-
A home inspection with the permission of the listing agent, you can go in with a home inspector before offers deadline.
So the buyer can spend that money for the.
Yeah, if they
inspection,
wish
but
to.
Not sure whether he will get the.
Yeah.
house or.
It's risky strategy, but some buyers do it. I've had buyers do it in the past. Right? If they want to write non-contingent, but they're not really feeling the love after looking at the seller's documents. I've seen buyers do that.
So don't they need the seller's permission?
Yes, they need the seller's permission via their agent. Yes. Very often the seller's agent will say, you can go in there, but don't produce a report. Because if you produce a report, the seller will be obligated to share it with everybody. Yeah. All right. So, any other questions from the YouTubers, Zoomers? Do you guys on Zoom have any questions in addition to what we've been talking about here?
Yes, I have
No.
one.
I have.
Yes.
Yes, another question from the room?
Yeah.
Are there any examples you want to cite for the cases where the buyer lost their deposits? Yes.
That's a whole other conversation. The buyer will lose their deposit if they don't close.
Right.
Or they don't put their deposit in and the seller can go after them then too. Right? If the buyer wants to cancel in a non-contingency, buyer has no contingencies and wants to cancel, the deposit is at risk.
But you have seen cases.
Oh, I've seen all three of those. And that gets into a whole other area that we're not gonna be able to get to today around how do you manage it. Remember that you are not supposed to get into deposit disputes. So if the contract is pretty clear that the seller should keep the deposit under certain circumstances, like if the buyer doesn't close escrow, or if the buyer cancels in a non-contingent environment, which means they're not going to close escrow, then the seller has a right to keep the deposit. If the seller is refusing, your client, the seller is refusing, or your buyer saying, I don't want to pay it, then you have to refer them to attorneys. We can't be in the middle of that dispute. It's a legal matter then. Yes.
If as a listing agent, as you mentioned, that he can allow, buyer to go in and inspect but do not produce a report. But listing agent should get the permission from the seller before allowing the buyer.
Yes. Sure. It depends. I mean, yes, they should. All right. But there are certainly plenty of listing agents who don't bother their seller, especially if it's an out-of-state seller who doesn't really care. Right. But it's not a bad idea. All right. That's a great question. Those are great questions. This QR code here, we're out of time, so I'm just going to give you the QR code. This QR code will allow you to get a copy of this slide deck that we just did. The name of the class is Protect Your Buyer Standard Buyer Contingencies, or Protect Your Client Standard Buyer, something like that. It starts with the word protect. So you'll see it in the list of classes. You can get the QR code and watch the class, go through all my slides again. Yes. Thank you guys for being here. I'm glad there were so many of you on Zoom and in person. I really appreciate you guys spending the hour with me, and I hope everybody has an awesome week.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.